All right, I want to welcome everyone to this week's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am the chapter chair, Bruce McClure, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, before we get started, okay. Art Springsteen was a charter member of our chapter, the first to sign on when I polled New Hampshire and Maine SABR members a couple of years ago. He was eager for some activity here in northern New England and became an early cheerleader for our chapter, offering advice and guidance on programs and offerings in the chapter, as well as a lot of encouragement as we got started. Last Tuesday, May 28th, Art passed away at the age of 75. His love of baseball and SABR was a bright light for our chapter, and he will be terribly missed. We extend our heartfelt condolences to his widow, Kathy, and their daughter, Anne. So, here we are. And now let's get on to our feature presentation. Hopefully somewhere up there, Art's watching tonight. Steve Rennie is fresh off his appearance at the Frederick Ivor-Campbell 19th Century Baseball Conference this past February. And tonight he will be giving his well-received presentation entitled Forgotten Gems, Ottawa's Early Baseball History. Nestled between Montreal and Toronto, Ottawa boasts a rich baseball heritage dating back to the mid-1860s. This presentation sheds light on Ottawa's early baseball era, uncovering spirited rivalries, forgotten teams, and memorable games played in culturally significant locations across the city. Steve Rennie spent more than 10 years working as a journalist covering federal politics and national news in Ottawa. He left journalism 8 years ago to work in the Canadian government, where he is now a director leading on artificial intelligence. He was recently elected president of SABR's Frank Shag Shaughnessy chapter in Ottawa. Steve Rennie, welcome to Northern New England. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Terrific. Thank you for doing this evening. We really appreciate you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here and really glad to see some folks from Ottawa on the screen as well. It makes me feel at home, even though I am at home.
This is great. The floor is yours, my friend.
All right. Let me just share my screen and I'll jump right into it. All right. How's that looking? Can you see that okay? All right. Well, thanks again for the opportunity to talk a little bit about baseball in Ottawa. As Bruce was mentioning in the introduction, I think we have an interesting story to tell that often gets lost in when you're thinking about Canadian baseball. You're already taking a smaller subset of sort of baseball history, and then you want to talk about the teams here. Typically, Toronto, Montreal teams get mentioned because they have a longer history, bigger population centers. But Ottawa, I think, has a unique place in history, and I'm hoping to share some of that with you this evening. So just a little bit of background before we jump right in. So as I mentioned, people in Ottawa have a long history of baseball that stretches back to the mid-1860s and possibly even before that. And baseball's rise in Ottawa really coincided with the city growing from an early from its early days as being named as the capital until the end of the 19th century when it was really starting to flourish. And it was sort of uniquely placed because, being the center of government, you had people worked in the government, you had politicians, business owners, and other people who had the leisure time and the money to be able to play a sport like baseball. Not a lot of folks at the time would have had a ton of leisure time, but Ottawa was unique in the sense that we had a lot of people that worked in these professions. So did afford itself to being able to play baseball. So I'm going to just start going through a bit, but you'll see some pictures of Ottawa at the time. Here's Ottawa in 1874, and you can see up in the top right-hand corner the Rideau Canal and the Ottawa River. We'll just jump right in. So just a bit of a timeline here. So it becomes the capital of the province of Canada in 1857. And then when Canada becomes a country in 1867, it remains the capital. You may have seen pictures of the Parliament buildings. So that's sort of in this sort of middle quadrant here, if you're looking on the map there. They started being built in the 1870s. But Ottawa's interesting in the sense that it's always been a very innovative town. We were one of the first cities to have electricity in our streets, and we had street lights and streetcars in the 1880s and 1890s. And I mentioned that the kind of early technology. Well, 100 years later, we went through another tech boom. Ottawa was widely seen as being the heart of a lot of the big tech companies that were starting up in Canada. So we had a Nortel and companies like that. So it kind of goes through waves, but it's always been an innovative city in a lot of ways. And at the time, certainly a very vibrant modern city in the late 19th century. So here you can see some pictures of what Ottawa would have looked like at the time. So these are sort of 1860s, 1880s. You've got Sparks and Elgin Street, which is right downtown, about a block away from the Parliament buildings. You've got City Hall at the time, which would have been right downtown as well. You can see a few more photos here. So again, more downtown pictures, just to give you a sense of what the city would have looked like at the time. But we're really here to talk about baseball and how Ottawa got its origins in the game. And we're going to go through here. I'll just pause on this slide here. This is unique in the sense that you don't see a lot of photos of kids teams or children's teams where they've got uniforms on at the time. So this is sort of unique in that sense, kind of the upside down maple leaf there. Not quite sure what all this signifies, but it's certainly unusual that you would see kids with matching uniforms. So I've never really dug into this story, but it would be interesting to find out more about the Maple Leaf baseball team. So like most things, there's not a particular moment where we can point to say Ottawa started playing baseball at any given day or any given time, but this is the earliest published reference I can find to a game of baseball being played in the city. So this would have happened in September in the fall of 1865 at a fair, probably an agricultural fair in the village of Metcalfe. So that would be, it's part of the city now, but at the time it would have been, a bit of a distance to reach it to get out to Metcalfe. Now it takes about half an hour from downtown to get there. So it's still a small village, but this is where they first mentioned baseball. So you can see there's a number of references here. They play cricket and baseball and sack and wheelbarrow and et cetera, et cetera. Now this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because it's, they're obviously the mention of baseball itself is interesting that it's so old, but what stood out to me is what's not mentioned here. And that's any description of what baseball is, which tells you that they would have known what baseball was in 1865. And so they may have even been playing it before then. Obviously, the game had been played long before 1865, but you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, well, the Citizen, the newspaper, the Ottawa Citizen, didn't bother to mention what the game is and how it's played, so people obviously had a familiarity with it. But we think it's still pretty new in 1865 because this is the first game reference I can find. And so this is a game between a team from Ottawa and a team from Ogdensburg, New York. And it's significant again for a couple of reasons. One, they got completely blown out. You can see the score there, 141-20. So that tells us that the Ottawa team's probably not very good, which may suggest that the game is still fairly new to the Ottawa players at this time. And even the newspaper kind of mentions that the players weren't that familiar with the rules of the game, and they were interested to learn more about how it was played. So if we kind of put things together, I'm kind of thinking that around mid-1860s, the game is starting to come to Ottawa. Not a ton of familiarity with it, but people are starting to pick it up a little bit. You can see that in 1867 they did that, and so the newspaper makes a prediction that we'll see them. They'll do better a year from now, and so we go a year from now. So they play again Ogdensburg. And they in fact do a lot better. By the third inning, they're ahead by 24 runs. So they're doing well, but somehow they blow their lead and they ended up losing by 8 runs. So they don't say this final score anywhere, but Ottawa has improved in a year. So in a short amount of time, they've come to, I don't know if they played the same Ogdensburg team, but they don't mention who the players were. But they're doing better a year from now, a year from then rather. And then they all go out for dinner after, which was customary at the time. But what really kind of I want to focus on here is a guy named Tom Clough, because I think he's pretty instrumental to the Ottawa baseball story. So Tom Clough, born, his parents are Irish immigrants. He's born in 1843, although there's records of him being born in other years. And in the early 1860s, he goes down to Ohio to work as at a streetcar company. And while he's down there, he learns the trade of blacksmithing. And he's down in Ohio when the Civil War breaks out. So he enlists as a private in the Civil War on the Union side and fights in the Civil War. And then goes back to Canada no later than 1868. But it's difficult. There's not a lot of records on his war service. The only one I could find was military pension records from 1903, and they mention a Thomas Clough who served with one of the regiments in Ohio, but they also say he used an alias. So it's not clear if that's the same Tom Clough as this Tom Clough, or does that just happen to be another guy with his name? So this is just to establish he's got some connection to Ohio, and this becomes important in a couple of years. So he comes back to Ottawa. He's active in a number of sports. He's working as a blacksmith in Ottawa. He and his brothers are very, very athletic. A lot of the sports stories in the newspaper reference him and his brothers, running track and snowshoeing and a number of other sports, cricket, some other ones. So he's very athletic family. He gets married, and then a few months later, he goes down to Ohio again, this time around the Cincinnati area where his brother's living, his brother Ned. And his brother's a fair bit older than he is. And the story that gets told is that Tom Clough goes to a 4th of July party, sees a game of baseball being played, becomes interested in the game. And then a few weeks later, he and his brother and his nephews go to see a game just outside of Cincinnati on a farm. And the Cincinnati Red Stockings, 3 players are there, and they're putting on a bit of a show, an exhibition for the people at the picnic. And Tom Clough is apparently watching this and becomes very, very interested. He's infatuated watching them play. And after their show is done, he goes over to them and he's just pumping them full of questions. What is this? How do you play? And he's the story is that he gets a set of rules and a bat and a ball and goes back to Ottawa and has all that reproduced. So he's not the first to play baseball in Ottawa, but he goes back to Ottawa with his interest, and he starts, there's one of the founding members of the Ottawa Baseball Club. Interestingly, he's not on the executive or anything. He's just one of the players, but he's one of the founders of it. And that's important for a few reasons. The Ottawa Baseball Club kind of really gets going in 1871. And so they spend a season playing and getting better. But in 1872, they leased some land near the bottom of Elgin Street. So you can see that red dot up in the corner. So this is a map from 1876. So a few years after they would have built this, but that's the baseball diamond up there. You can actually see they have it on the map. So this would have been just about at Ottawa city limits at the time. You can see they're densely populated buildings and houses, and then kind of fields, and then you get out to the baseball diamond. Right now, if you were to go there today, that's a very nice part of town. In the Glebe, it's called. A lot of very nice, expensive homes there. So, but at one time it was a baseball diamond, and they did quite a job, and they built it very quickly. So they lease this 10-acre plot of land, and they build a big fence around it. And they built a grandstand and refreshment booths. And notably, they don't serve alcohol. They make it a point not to have any alcohol served there. And then they set up a game against the Boston Red Sox in 1872. And so the Boston Red Stockings come and they play a game against Ottawa. And the Ottawa, the game's held on the 27th of August in 1872. And lots of interest in Ottawa. People are very excited about it. Lots of enthusiasm. There's lots of news articles in the newspaper. And, it just becomes like a baseball fever is really gripping Ottawa at the time. And so at that point, they have the day of the game, and you can see the Red Stockings will come. Hang on, let's scroll ahead to that slide. Yeah, so Boston comes to Ottawa. Ottawa fans completely blown away. There's articles in the newspaper about how muscular and how athletic the Boston team looks compared to Ottawa, and you've got this professional team playing against what would have been just amateurs. Like these guys are like firefighters and various people who work around town. So they're not professional by any stretch of the imagination. And so they play against Ottawa, and they lost in 1872 by a score of 64-0. So they don't score a single run. A couple of notable players in that game. So there's Al Spalding's pitching in the game, and Ross Barnes is playing second base. And so it's not really any wonder that the Ottawa team didn't do so well in that game. And I'll scroll ahead here. There we go. Okay, so 1873, Boston comes back, and this is notable because there's a player on Ottawa, George Jumbo Latham, or Juice Latham, he can be sometimes called. So Ottawa doesn't do as badly in this game. They only lose 44-4, but Latham plays really, really well in the game. So much that Boston's manager, Harry Wright, takes notice of Latham's play. You can even see in the Citizen, they talk about, you can't see it here because it's very tiny, but they basically say that Latham played as well as anybody on the Boston side. And so they're very, very complimentary towards him, and Harry Wright's certainly impressed. And he offers Latham a contract, which is sort of unheard of at the time. They don't have a lot of contracts being offered, and particularly multi-year ones. So he actually first invites Latham to come on the Red Stockings British tour in 1874, but that doesn't happen for various reasons. And I think the quote from Wright when Latham makes this request that he get a contract was, you need to remember you're unknown to the club, either personally or by reputation. And the last time I saw you, you weren't able to run, although in other respects, I was favorably impressed by your playing. So Latham's a big guy. He's not very fast. But Harry Wright is basically telling him at this point, you haven't proved yourself. Nobody knows who you are. So it's a little bit presumptuous to ask for a contract. But he gets a contract. It's a 3-year deal. So the contract pays him $560 in his first year, and then every subsequent year will pay him another $800. But there's a 90-day out clause. So if in the first 90 days the Red Stockings aren't happy with him, then they can cut him, and that's what they do. He doesn't make it past the 90-day period and gets cut loose, and he goes on to play in a number of other places. Kind of bounces around. So that's probably the most notable thing to come out of this 1873 game against Boston. So there's lots of venues around the city. So we've talked about some of the characters. I think we'll talk now about some of the venues where people would have played this game. Lots of articles in the papers from back then about kids playing in the streets, and that's met with different reactions. There's articles about people who are kind of upset that they have this noise or these disruptive kids who are playing baseball. Of course, now it'd be wonderful to have more people out playing baseball, but at the time they were not overly happy by that. Lots of complaints about games on Sundays, which there was laws against that, so you couldn't do it. But Ottawa, I'll just talk about a few of the sites. Here's Cartier Square. Cartier Square was a military site. It's still downtown. It's actually where our city hall is now, but it's right downtown by the Rideau Canal. And you can kind of see in the background there, and you can see the guards here outside. This is where they would have played, on this field. But Ottawa, being a seat of government and a very bureaucratic city, had a couple of idiosyncrasies. And one of them was that you had to write and request permission from the Department of Militia and Defense if you wanted to play baseball here on the field. And so you can see some pictures here. This is what Cartier Square looked like inside, and there's in the field outside frozen. But you used to have to write these letters. And so you can see some examples here where someone would ask and request permission, and they'd send it off to the Department of Militia and Defense, and then a few days later they'd get a response that would either grant or deny their request, and then with a couple of conditions, don't get in the way of the soldiers doing drills or any of the other players that other teams that may have been granted permission to play there. You can see here's the Victoria Baseball Club, and then the Celtic Benefit Association, and then the very delightfully named Eclipse Office Furniture Baseball Club. So they've got a number of these requests that kind of go back and forth, and you can see them granting it. The other notable venue that I'll mention is the Metropolitan Grounds, which are downtown. Well, I guess more in the glebe now. They would be, and this was controlled by the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But it's notable because it was the home of the Senators Baseball Club, and I'll talk a bit about that name a little bit later. Short-lived Senators from 1898, as well as our football team, the Rough Riders. So that was around until 1900. They got rid of it. So the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club was formed in 1889, and the idea was it was very similar to what other cities had done. Particularly Montreal had started an athletic association or athletic club, and so they had a headquarters downtown, and they formed this athletic club to run sort of as an umbrella organization for all the sports teams in Ottawa. And you had to have a certain amount of money to be able to play. So it seemed to be kind of an elite group. And the cost to actually join was fairly high at the time. You had to pay, I think there was a couple of different tiers of membership. And I'll just see if I can find exactly how much it was. Yeah, it was about $10 a year or $2 a month. And you could pay that and then become a member, or you could pay $100 and become a lifetime member, which would have been a lot of money at the time. Or you could be a member for 15 years and you'd become this kind of privileged level. So they had these tiers. Women were allowed to join as they called them lady associate members, but they had a lot fewer privileges than the men did. So we had a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, there's people with disposable income, there's people with the time to do this, so they tended to join the things like the Amateur Athletic Club. This particular club is notable because it's really reinforces the kind of the three colors that Ottawa sports teams have typically worn over the years: the red, white, and black. That was the official colors of this club, and then our subsequent teams in different sports have used those colors since. You can see on the left-hand side here, picture some parliamentary pages. So pages are sort of like the messengers of Parliament. There's these young kids that ferry messages back and forth between the politicians and take care of administrative tasks. And there's a photo here from 1900. You can see them there. This photo is notable because Tommy Gorman is one of the pages in this picture, and he's born in Ottawa. He was a page, became a page after his dad died when he was a young boy. And this would have been a fairly well-paying position for a youngster like him. $45 a month is a considerable amount of money at the time. And certainly would have been needed by his family with his father around. And so he was one of the players who played on the pages. And he went on to have a varied and very successful career in a number of different things. So he was a lacrosse player and a gold medalist in that in 1908. He was a newspaper reporter and sports editor. He went on to be one of the founders of the National Hockey League. He got involved with the Senators baseball team, and now he's in the Hockey Hall of Fame after he won a number of Stanley Cups as a general manager. So very, very successful sports personality here in Ottawa, and played early on for these parliamentary pages. Another notable figure from Ottawa would be Jack Humphreys. He was born in North Gore, which again now is part of the city of Ottawa, but at the time would have been a village just outside of it. But he's our first real player who made to the majors, and so he played briefly for the New York Gothams, and was really, I guess, one of the most important parts of his story, because he didn't have a very spectacular career, but he formed the first all-Canadian battery with Tip O'Neill. He was a catcher, and Tip O'Neill was the pitcher, and that was the first time in the majors they'd had all-Canadian battery. So he's notable for that, and he sort of, had a cup of coffee in the majors and kind of bounced around a little bit and got into education. Was taught math and Latin, and lived out in California. He was also the father of the poet Rolfe Humphreys, and he gets a mention in the poem Polo Grounds. This is just to really highlight that Ottawa and politics and baseball are all kind of intertwined here. So these are a series of trading cards from 1895 by the Bain Wagon Company of Woodstock, Ontario. And you can see they're kind of depicting a number of politicians, not always in flattering terms, just kind of highlighting the links between sports and politics in the city here. So you can see Sir Johnny MacDonald's former prime minister, first prime minister, getting bopped in the nose with a baseball bat, and a few other politicians there. This is Ottawa's first professional club. In 1898, in the middle of the Eastern League season, the Rochester team was really struggling, and the Spanish-American War is really doing a number on attendance right across the Eastern League. Attendance is down, revenues are down. Rochester's struggling. The season before, they had lost a team to Montreal. It's not looking good for Rochester. So the Eastern League meets. The executives of the Eastern League meet in July of 1898. And one of the drastic measures they take is a 20% pay cut right across the board. So all the players get their pay lopped off by 20%. And then the other decision they make is they got to move Rochester. And so a few different teams, a few different cities rather, kind of emerge as potential candidates to be host to the new team. So you can see that Ottawa is one of the teams, and it's there's mention of some other places as well. And so Ottawa at the time has been sort of totally separate from this. The newspapers at the time have been starting this campaign to bring professional baseball to Ottawa. So the Ottawa Citizen, which is sort of the largest daily newspaper that we have, and was there at the time too, is saying basically, look at these teams in the Eastern League. Ottawa has a much bigger population. We have good baseball players here. We could definitely support a team. And the city looks at it almost like an economic opportunity, so as a bit of promotion for itself. And that's the way it's represented, was that, Ottawa, an Ottawa baseball team playing in major markets in the Eastern League will help raise the city's profile and maybe attract some investment and some interest in Ottawa. So that's really how it's pitched. And so the Citizen kind of goes on this this campaign, and it's publishing article after article after article over a number of weeks in June and July, advocating for a team. And that kind of dovetails nicely with the challenges that the Eastern League is having, and what the Rochester franchise is having as well. And so it comes down to Ottawa and Worcester, Massachusetts, and Ottawa gets picked as the team. You'll often see this team referred to as the Wanderers, and I'll get into that in a little bit. It's a name that seems to have been bestowed on the team many years later, but at the time, that's not what they were called. They don't have a lot of success. They lose their first couple of games. The first one at home, 8-1, they lose, and they lost their next one as well by 10-7, so a little bit closer. And they only play the first two of their games at the at Lansdowne Park, which is sort of a big stadium that we have now. It's the site of our football stadium in our in sort of downtown Ottawa. But at the time, that's where they thought they would play, and so they only played their first two games there. But they weren't able to play the rest of the season there because there was scheduling conflicts with the lacrosse team that had that owned the lease to the stadium, and it just wasn't going to work for them. So they moved to the Metropolitan Stadium, which I mentioned earlier. It's not too far away. It's a short walk up from Lansdowne Park to the Metropolitan Stadium, but not nearly as big. The problem was Sunday games. You couldn't play Sunday games in Ottawa, so they had to play some games over in Hull on Sundays on the Gatineau side, or on the Hull side of the river, the Quebec side of the river, where that was allowed. So they maintained about a 500 record through most of their season. They came mid-July. They're playing 500 baseball till towards the end of August. And then they go on this big losing streak. They lost 14 of their last 15 games. They finish with a record of 53-70, and they're losing lots of money. There's before the season ends, there's an article in the newspaper from one of the owners of the team saying, we're going to need to raise more money because we're not going to be able to keep a team here if that happens. There's even threats midway through August that they'll just move the team again somewhere else. And people aren't really interested in seeing this middling team, so attendance is dropping, and interest is waning in the team. They end up losing a reported $4,000, even though they played less than 2 months, which is a lot of money to lose in a short amount of time. So it's no surprise they don't stick around. So Ottawa has a cup of coffee in the majors, or in the professional leagues in 1898. You're probably wondering about the uniforms from that last picture. You can see them wearing these very unusual tartan uniforms. There's a guy named Craig Brown. He runs a site called Threads of Our Game. If you don't know it, you should check it out. It's a really interesting site where he tries to recreate the colors of old uniforms based on newspaper articles. And he's kind of done this green and purplish colors, but I don't think that's quite it. He and I have kind of gone back and forth, and it's been modified a little bit, but I think it was actually red and gray and black and white would have been the colors, and that's certainly what they had in the newspapers. You can see a number of articles that say the colors are red, black, and white, or there's some that mention gray with red trim. So I think that was probably more of a monochrome with some red highlights and then kind of the white hat and the white belt. But the first few games, they actually wore their old Rochester uniforms, and there's articles in the paper about how the lettering on the front of their shirts was peeling off, or some players had taken them off. So you have this kind of real array of different spellings, as a Roch and Chester and not different spellings of it. So they move into these new uniforms, and they're notable for that. I think it's fair to say mixed reviews for the uniforms. So Ottawa newspapers very, very complimentary, talking about they're the most stylish looking team in the league, and they're really leaving a great impression. But virtually every newspaper outside the city has a much different take on the uniforms. Some of them are actually quite funny. This one here, if they're talking about Ottawa, it says when they were known as the Rochesters, but if anybody, or long dissertations are published on the appearance of the Ottawas, but when they were known as the Rochesters. But if anybody wants to see a site, it is worth going to the ball grounds to see the awful uniforms the men are now rigged out in. No wonder they don't refuse to wear them. Or this one here, the general impression of the Eastern League circuit that the late Rochester uniform was the most hideous the engineer of man could devise. The new Ottawa outfit, however, knocks it into a crooked bat. So it's not too flattering takes on the uniforms. There is this one sort of article that maybe talks about some of the different colors they would have had, but I don't know. I think they just did it for sort of literary purposes. But you can see this poem where it says, a splurge Slafrino, a dash of blue and cream, and then they go on and on and on. I think they're just picking colors. There's nothing I can see in the actual articles from the papers at the time that would have mentioned that they used those as their colors. So I really do think it was sort of like red and black and white and gray. So now, as far as calling them the Senators, so if you go to Baseball Reference or any of these websites, they're always referred to as the Wanderers. But no newspaper at the time would have called this team the Wanderers. In fact, none did. And this seems to be a name that was applied in later years. And that, just before I get into the Senators piece, the Wanderers name was often given to hockey teams that relocated in the era, especially if they moved to new arenas or cities. And so that could be why in later years this team was called the Wanderers, but there's actually ample evidence to suggest they were called the Senators. And you can see this one article here on the far left of your screen. A Toronto sports writer actually suggested that, because this team plays in the nation's capital, they should follow the Washington team, the Senators, and also adopt the Senators name, since they're both the Capitals. So that was the first suggestion, sort of not too long after they came into the city, only 4 days after their first game. And then you can see a number of other references to the Senators. So the Senators won, the Senators won. It's very casually just mentioning, the Senators played good ball this afternoon, and references throughout. So I'm fairly confident in saying that the team would have been known to most people as the Senators and not the Wanderers. And you can see a couple more references here. Interestingly, there's a Toronto Evening Star article that references them as the Lumbermen very early in their tenure, but it seems that name didn't really gain any traction because there's no other references to them being called the Lumbermen. So there's the Senators. So they were our first entry into professional baseball, and then we've had subsequent teams over the years that have come and gone, but they were the first, and they were notable. So I will stop there. And happy to take any questions you might have about baseball in Ottawa.
So if you have a question for Steve Rennie, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the reactions button. When you hit that, you will see the button that's marked raise hand. When you hit that, you'll be in line to ask questions of our presenter tonight, Steve Rennie. First off, I want to, I noticed in that team photo with those gloriously fantastic tartan uniforms, there's 4 dudes with bagpipes. That is my kind of ball club right there, being the Scotsman that I am. Is there any notes or discussion about why they had 4 guys with bagpipes?
Yeah, this was right around their uniform unveiling. So early August, they did the unveiling and they had a bit of a show. So they had the bagpipers there and team there, and they put on it was a bit of a parade for the game. So typically they wouldn't have them at the games, but this was just because this was the big unveiling of the uniforms. They wanted to have them on site. But yeah, definitely interesting. You can see you got the 4 of them, you've got the team. None of the players, interestingly, look terribly pleased in those photos. So I don't know if that's a reflection on the uniforms.
Joe Ross, you're up. How you doing?
Okay, thank you. 2 quick things. First, I believe the Red Stockings became the Braves, not the Red Sox. So when you refer to the Boston Red Sox and the Boston Red Stockings, that's not the same team.
That's right. Did I say Red Sox?
Yeah, you did. And I know the Red Stockings became the Braves, not the Red Sox.
That's right. Well, if I did, that's a verbal slip on my part. Apologies for that.
I missed it. Yeah, he's right. Yep, go on.
The other thing, if they played to a 53-70 record, it sounds like they played 123 games, but they only played for 2 months. What did they play? 3 games a day?
They played in Rochester before that, right? That's the whole season.
Oh, okay. So the 2 months that they lost $4,000 was only in Ottawa?
Yeah, they lost $4,000 playing in Ottawa, but the record is for the whole Eastern League season. So that combines the record they had in Rochester and the record they had in Ottawa.
Did they do any better financially in Rochester?
No, I don't know how much they lost in Rochester, but they weren't making money. But they certainly didn't do any better when they got to Ottawa.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Who's playing baseball in Ottawa now? What's the baseball scene like up there these days?
We have a team in the Frontier League, the Titans, and they've been around for a few years now. But we've had teams come and go over the years. So, the Lynx, the Ottawa Lynx would have been our AAA team in the 90s, in the early 2000s. And then they moved to Lehigh Valley, became the Iron Pigs, and it ended 2007 season. And then we've had sort of this revolving door of teams playing in different leagues. We had some Can-Am teams and now Frontier League teams that have kind of come and gone. They tend to last for a season or 2, and then they fold and another team comes in. Part of that was because some of the early teams got saddled with a bad lease at the stadium. So our ballpark, if you know Ottawa at all, our ballpark is a bit out of the downtown core. It's towards the east end. It's not easy to get to necessarily. And so it has, and the other thing is they've cut the parking over the years too. So it's a hard place to get to, not really well served by transit, and they keep cutting the size of the parking lot. So it's any wonder that you can't get a lot of people out there to see baseball games.
Interesting. Dixie Tarango, you're up. How you doing, Dix?
I'm doing fine.
There you go.
Great presentation. I saw half of it in Cooperstown, but I was taking photographs of the double tracks, and I could only stay for half of it. 2 things. First of all, when they played the Red Stockings in 1872, that was fortunate for them to play that team that year, since that was the first year that Boston won the National Association Championship, because the year before they didn't. The question about the presentation is, those are great pictures you have. Where did you find them, and did you expect to find pictures that good?
Yeah, that took a lot of digging. So I looked at a number of places. We have sort of like your version of the National Archives. We've got something called Library and Archives Canada, which had a number of the old city photos. So that was good for those pictures. And then we also have some city archives here as well. So Ottawa City Archives, we've got the Bytown Museum, we've got a number of other places. So I was able to just go through those and find a lot of these pictures. And that, I will say that surprised me, because you don't expect to find too many pictures from back then, and certainly not of the quality that some of these ones are. And I was pleasantly surprised to see what's happening there. I was actually fortunate that I was able to find them too, because as part of our chapter, we're publishing a book next year on Ottawa's baseball history. So this will be a part of it, but it'll cover the whole history from the 1860s all the way up to present day. And a lot of these pictures will be in it. So that's I was fortunate I was able to find them, because I think it just gives you a bit of a reference point when you're looking at these people and these old pictures to get a bit more of a flavor of what the game would have looked like back then.
Ann, you're up. How you doing, Ann?
Good. How are you?
I'm terrific. Thanks for coming down.
Yeah, just a comment or whatever, a story. It's 20th century Ottawa baseball. But my dad was in the Can-Am League in 1939. And it was his first year in pro ball. They were associated with the Brooklyn Dodgers. But at any rate, his maybe fourth game in pro ball was in Ottawa. And what was happening in 1939, as you know, Steve, was King George and Queen Elizabeth were on their King George VI, their royal tour of Canada. And Dad was on the field when the king and queen came in a horse-drawn carriage right in front of him, and they had an exhibition game. And that was a highlight of his life. There were like 5,000 people in the stands, a lot of disabled children, I believe. And probably it was May 20th or 21st, 1939. But it was a highlight of his entire life to be that close to the reigning monarch of England and his wife.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, no doubt that would have been quite the highlight.
Yeah, it was.
Amazing.
And they played Ogdensburg and Rome, Utica, a lot of those teams. And he because of his time there, he created a lot of friends in baseball in Canada, mainly in Quebec City. I don't know if you know Roland Beaupre. Do you know that name at all? He was well known in Quebec. And that was some of the history with the Ottawa connection in our family.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it's always interesting to hear these Ottawa stories, because there seems to be they pop up every now and then, right? So.
Great stuff. Let's go to Karen Holleran. Karen, how are you?
Fine. How are you?
There you go. Terrific. Thanks for coming out.
I wanted to know were there any African American players
In the 19th century, none that I could find.
Okay, I didn't know if they had.
Not on the professional team anyway. It's possible on some of the city teams there would have been, but there don't tend to be a lot of photos of those teams. But we did have a very active baseball scene sort of in the 1870s and 1880s, where you've got a lot of these teams are playing each other. And the way they kind of did it was they would either form a league that would last a season or two with teams that varied. And they had these really colorful names, right? Like Clippers or the Mutuals, which, if you know anything about that history of that name, tends to be associated with the volunteer fire companies. The Pastimes, the Capitals, the Merchants, Electrics, Diamonds, Unions, Nationals, Hurons, like it goes on and on and on. And there's lots of write-ups of what these teams, their games, but there's not a lot of photos of them. So it's hard to tell if they would have been African Americans or African Canadians in this case.
Okay.
That would have been playing in them.
Well, my only question is, and this is a slightly off topic, but it does concern Ottawa. Me being a Montreal Alouettes fan, I'd like to know how you think the Red Blacks are going to do this year, Steve.
We'll see. I don't know. I never like to get too bold on any Ottawa sports team. Had my heart broken too many times. I was a lifelong Senators fan. I know the heartbreak that comes with getting expectations up around an Ottawa sports team.
My Alouettes won the CFL Grey Cup last year, so I'm gloating a little bit.
Yeah,
but
we had some early success when they came back.
Yeah, Yeah, now I understand why they call them the Red Blacks, though, because that's tradition with the colors in the city.
Yeah, they also liked the kind of reference to the New Zealand All Blacks,
Yes.
the rugby team. So they were kind of going with that kind of theme, Red Blacks. I think the name, people have gotten more used to it. I don't know that it was universally loved when they first came up with it. We for many years had a team called the Rough Riders, but they played in this very small league, the CFL. It's not a large league, with eight or nine teams, depending on the year. But they were one of two teams called the Rough Riders. So, to anybody looking from the outside, it could be very confusing. The only difference was one team didn't have a space between the words Rough Riders and the other did. Ottawa did. So,
just to confuse matters more up there, right?
Yeah, showing a lack of creativity when you got two teams.
There you go.
Rough Riders in the same league.
Joe Ross, where are you?
I'm up here. Steve.
There you go.
Great presentation. When you said that you didn't like to mention other teams because you were sadly disappointed. Are you sure you're not from Boston?
Oh, I knew that was coming.
I got Boston roots, but I'm not. Yeah, I got family going back to the 1600s from Boston.
Do you really?
Bruce, you knew that was coming, right?
I just said that, Joe. I knew that was coming. You have family that dates back to the 1600s in Boston, Steve?
Yeah, they settled in Salem in the mid 1600s, and then they moved to Boston in the early 1700s. Yeah. And, actually, there's a street in Boston, Milk Street, which is apparently named after my family. Their name would have been Milk or Milks back then, depending on the spelling.
Oh, really?
So if you see Milk Street there, it's not named after any milk merchants or anything like that. It's apparently named after my family. I like to believe it's named after my family.
Perfect. Do we have anything else for Steve Rennie? Any further questions, comments, anything like that this evening for Steve Rennie? Okay, well, it looks like we are set this evening, and I want to take this opportunity to thank Steve Rennie for his appearance this evening. But next week, on June 10th, for more than 40 years, serving as general manager for the Baltimore Orioles, California Angels, and Milwaukee Brewers. He was the principal architect of the Orioles dynasty and of the only American League championship the Milwaukee Brewers ever won. Lee's new book is the definitive biography of this trailblazing executive, entitled Leave When the Party is Good, The Life and Legacy of Baseball Executive Harry Dalton. That's next Monday, June 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern. Now, finally, I want to thank everyone for coming out, as well as thanking all of those who are watching right now on YouTube. If you like what we're doing up here in Northern New England, please subscribe to our channel to get alerts for each of our weekly updates. And if you're a baseball fan, you need to join SABR, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 70 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org/join today. Terrific meeting tonight, everybody. Thanks, Steve Rennie, for coming out to do this. We appreciate it. Nice round of applause for Steve. There we go.
Well, thank you very much. Your chapter is just an inspiration to the rest of us. So it's a real pleasure on my part to be here and see how you're doing it, because I think we can all learn from what you're doing here. Amazing.
Steve, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I did not know that I was going to have to send you a check too, but I'll get one in the mail to you.
It's in Canadian, so it's less. You're
okay.
Canadians are a bargain.
That's right. Perfect. All right, let's get everybody out of here. We'll see everybody next week, June 10th, 7 o'clock for Steve Rennie. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, Gus.
And Gus.